Senator Inhofe's plane will arrive later this morning, and I'm privileged to open the hearing in his behalf today and to recognize the ranking member, Senator Reid. The committee meets today to receive testimony on the posture of the U.S. Air Force and its fiscal year 2021 budget request. And this is Senator Inhofe's statement, which I'm happy to read on his behalf. We welcome Barbara Barrett, Secretary of the Air Force, and General David Goldfein, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Thank you both for your distinguished service and your continuing willingness to serve our great nation. The National Defense Strategy directs our nation's military to prepare for the return of great power competition. This means we must be prepared to deter and, if necessary, defeat our near-peer adversaries like Russia and China. In order for the Air Force to achieve that goal, it must be properly manned, trained, and equipped. At the end of the Obama administration, the Air Force was at a historic low in readiness and size. Less than 10% of combat squadrons were ready to deploy, and even less were prepared for a peer fight. We commend the progress you have made in rebuilding readiness, but more needs to be done. A high state of readiness is crucial for our nation to demonstrate peace through strength. While our forces suffered from being ill-prepared, our adversaries moved out and recapitalized both their conventional and nuclear forces with alarming speed. China and Russia present a credible threat to America and our allies. In fact, in some areas, they have even surpassed us. You both have testified that the Air Force is too small and too old to do what the nation asks. We agree with you and the many independent studies that show the Air Force needs to grow and modernize. But we are concerned that your current budget is inadequate to allow you to reach the requirement of 386 squadrons. Given the need to grow, there is concern that this year's budget request takes a risk by divesting the aircraft we need today in the hopes of buying modern capability in the future. Historically, that approach has failed to achieve the desired results. We understand that much of those decisions were caused by a flat budget that falls well short of the 3 to 5% growth recommended by the National Defense Strategy Commission report. In fact, it does not even keep up with inflation. Any successful modernization strategy needs to focus on results and meeting the needs of tomorrow's fight, but should also maintain forces capable of deterring and defeating an adversary today. We look forward to working with you to ensure that we meet the needs of today's warfighters while modernizing to ensure we regain our advantages for the future. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me join you in welcoming Secretary Barrett and General Goldfein to the committee this morning to testify on the plans and programs of the Department of the Air Force and our review of the fiscal year 2021 President's budget request. We're grateful, certainly, to all the men and women of the Air Force for their service and to their families for their continued support. I want to particularly note that this will probably be General Goldfein's last appearance before the committee as Air Force Chief of Staff. I want to thank you, General Goldfein, for your many years of distinguished and dedicated service to the men and women of the United States Air Force and to this nation. Thank you very much, sir. In preparing this budget request, the Air Force faced difficult decisions in balancing the need to modernize and keep the technological advantage over near-peer competitors, and the need to support ongoing operations and sustain today's readiness. This budget request tries to maintain that balance by increasing funding to address readiness concerns and munitions shortfalls, but also funding technologies for the future fight and modernization of our strategic deterrent capability. I'm interested in the witnesses' views on what the most difficult decisions were. I also understand that the Secretary of Defense has asked the military departments to undertake a review to find resources, and I would like to know the status of that review. But also note that because significant levels of funding are being transferred to build the wall on the southern border, some Air Force modernization efforts will not proceed as planned, making it harder to find savings to apply to high-priority programs and activities. I'm interested in hearing if the Air Force has a plan to mitigate this issue. This year, the Air Force is proposing to retire and realign a number of aircraft systems, presumably to free up resources for other programs. The budget request will reduce or alter force structure for A-10s, B-1s, C-130s, KC-135s, KC-10s, Global Hawks, and Reapers. Any Air Force proposal deserves our careful consideration, but we must consider it against the recent history of abrupt Air Force changes of direction on such programs as A-10, U-2, Global Hawk, J-STARS, Compass Call, AWACS, Light Attack Aircraft, and C-27 airlift aircraft, several of which I will admit were reversed by congressional action. I hope the witnesses will provide the committee with their reasoning for these retirements and realignments and assurances that decisions are well thought out before disruptions to force structure begin. Perhaps most troubling to me among the force structure adjustments is the planned reduction in the air fueling tanker force in the near term. The commander of TRANSCOM recently testified before this committee that the scarcity of available tankers has solely taxed his command's ability to keep up with the peacetime demand, let alone manage support for major contingency operations. As we all know, while the KC-46 is being accepted by the Air Force in taking air crews, it is only operating with significant restrictions. Coupling that with the early retirement of KC-135s and KC-10s creates significant risk in our refueling capability. I want to hear why you have proposed this in the face of TRANSCOM's significant concerns. I'm also interested in hearing about your continuing effort to improve the shortfalls within the remotely piloted aircraft operator community and how the Air Force has addressed shortfalls within the larger pilot community and maintenance personnel. Certainly, if the Air Force would retire a large number of Global Hawks and Reapers, that action would help the shortfall by reducing demand for pilots. However, I'm interested to know whether you have had a reduction in demand for Reaper support from the combatant commanders and how their input has affected your decisions. 2 years ago, the Air Force budget proposed to truncate the Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar Systems, or JSTARS, modernization program and replace it with a combination of other systems, including unmanned systems and overhead sensors. That program has since been named the Advanced Battle Management System, or ABMS, and I look forward to receiving an update on progress of the ABMS system. Again, there are many issues to cover, and I thank both Secretary Barrett and General Goldfein for being here today and look forward to your responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Reed. Secretary Barrett and General Goldfein, you submitted a joint statement which will be entered into the record at this point. Would each of you like to make a brief 5-minute opening statement? Secretary Barrett.
Thank you very much. Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, members of the committee, thank you for inviting us to appear before you today. I also would like to acknowledge and thank David Goldfein, whose final appearance before this committee for this purpose will be today. I'd like to thank him for the incomparable service that he has provided to the United States Air Force, making the Air Force better and our nation better. It's been a great privilege to serve with General Goldfein. The international security environment changes unpredictably. China and Russia challenge American capabilities with new technologies and new systems. Iran and North Korea threaten regional and global stability, while violent extremism remains a global menace. The National Defense Strategy calls for the Air Force as a critical component of the joint force to deter and, if needed, defeat these threats. This fiscal year 21 budget request sets the course for the Air Force we need to accomplish these aims. Specifically, the United States Air Force invests in a future force that allows us to connect the joint force, dominate space, generate combat power, and conduct logistics under attack. We will continue to present ready forces to combatant commanders as we defend the homeland, ensure strategic deterrence, and counter violent extremism. Finally, we will strengthen the foundation of our forces, our airmen, as we develop and care for our people and their families. This budget submission shifts force design to create irreversible momentum toward achieving the mission of the NDS, while growing strong and resilient leaders and families. The top policy priority for the Department is the successful launch of the United States Space Force. The space domain is integral to the joint team's success in all warfighting domains. The Department of the Air Force supports a lean, agile service to preserve access to space for America and our allies while deterring and, if necessary, defeating malicious actions. Our most important investment is in connecting the Joint Force. We are developing the technologies to connect every sensor, every shooter, and every echelon of command to enable seamless joint all-domain operations. This battle network is essential to defeating current and future threats. We are also directing pivotal resources to recruit and retain the best people our nation has to offer. We are an inclusive and diverse force and are modernizing our promotion system while investing in the professional development of airmen. The Air Force is expanding ongoing efforts to support and care for families. We are tackling privatized housing and PFAS challenges. Along with our sister services, we encourage state reciprocity for occupational licensing, for spouses, and for quality schools for our children. And we are investing in professionally designed and advised programs to reduce suicides and sexual assaults. To fund the Air Force we need, we must divest some aging legacy systems. This budget retires limited numbers of aircraft, consolidating resources to increase readiness in remaining aircraft, or invest in recapitalization and modernization efforts. We thank the committee and the entire Congress for fully funding the recovery efforts to rebuild Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases. We will seek additional support as our installations and personnel assist with the ongoing novel coronavirus quarantine and responsive efforts. With your continued support, America's Air Force stands ready to deter, defend, and defeat any adversary. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. General Goldfein.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to present my last budget submission for the first time with Secretary Barbara Barrett, the 25th Secretary of the Air Force. She's an inspiring leader who cares deeply about airmen and their families, and this hearing allows me the opportunity to publicly thank her on behalf of all active Guard, Reserve, and civilian airmen who stand the watch, own the high ground, and follow her lead. Thank you, ma'am. So my bottom line up front, this budget, building on the last three, offers the most aggressive package of strategic trades we have made as a service in over 2 decades to achieve complete alignment with the National Defense Strategy and secure our nation's military superiority over the next decade. Secretary Esper's guidance for this budget build was crystal clear. Build an Air Force that can compete, deter, and win shoulder to shoulder with our joint teammates and our allies and partners against a nuclear peer in an era of great power competition. This budget is designed to achieve this objective, and we're asking for your support to make the tough but necessary trades we'll discuss today. In numerous war games against our best assessment of the threat in 2030 and beyond, as Secretary Barrett stated, we found that investment in 4 key areas produced the Air Force needed to prevail. First, this budget connects the joint force in ways we are not today connected in order to truly fight as a joint team. Under the leadership of our chairman, General Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs and the combatant commanders are fully engaged in developing a new doctrine of warfare called Joint All-Domain Operations. Under this warfighting construct, the Air Force is the designated lead service to connect platforms, sensors, and weapons from all domains, all services, and our allies and partners so we can truly operate at the speed of relevance. We call it Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2 for short, and we're moving out quickly with Advanced Battle Management, sir, as the Pathfinder. Every 4 months, we host a demonstration and link joint capabilities that are not currently connected to advance joint all-domain operations to the next level. And I look forward to describing what we've achieved to date and where we're headed during questioning. Second, we must dominate space. And while you'll have a follow-on hearing in April with Chief Jay Raymond and Secretary Barrett focused on the Space Force and Department of the Air Force investments, I want you to know that it is my top priority to make Chief Raymond and his new service successful. Our third area of focus is generating combat power, beginning with our nuclear enterprise. This budget moves us forward to recapitalize our two legs of the triad and the critical nuclear command and control that ties it all together. And fourth, this budget invests in a new way of approaching how we keep our joint team deployed and sustained in contested combat environments. We must assume our logistics enterprise will be under attack. The foundation of this budget submission is the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal, our airmen. We look forward to working with this committee to ensure that we keep the faith with the airmen that will defend the nation, and we support their families entrusted to our care. As this committee is aware, and as was stated, the 21 top line is relatively flat from last year, well short, as the chairman stated, of the 3 to 5% growth required to properly support the national defense strategy. In a flat budget environment, if a service is to move forward, it must do two things. It must make better use of what it has by connecting all platforms, sensors, and weapons in a battlefield network, JADC2. And it must find internal savings to pay for new capabilities. So we held our own night court and identified $21 billion across the FYDP by retiring the oldest of our legacy weapon systems that are either not survivable or do not contribute significantly to the 2030 peer fight. And not one of these trades is easy. Every weapon system we're asking to retire has performed well in the current fight, but many are at the end of their service life or have no future in a nuclear peer fight. This is today's hard reality. And not surprisingly, of the services, the Air Force has the largest classified portfolio of investment. This makes the story harder to tell, since most of what we are retiring is unclassified and visible, while many of our game-changing investments are classified. And I want to thank many of you for taking our classified briefing and offer it to any of you or your staff between now and endgame. When you see what we're trading for, our budget submission will make more sense. If we're to achieve truly meaningful gains for our nation's security through implementing the NDS in a flat budget environment, we must work together on these hard choices. Chairman, I'm honored to be the 21st Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And if we go to war against a nuclear peer, I'm 100% confident that we have what we will need to win. And I can say that because of decisions made by my predecessors, men like John Jumper and Mike Ryan, such as the lead time required for building an Air Force. And I believe one of my jobs is to ensure that when Chief 24 sits in front of this committee in 2030, that chief will be able to state with equal confidence that our nation's Air Force has what it needs to win. With your support, we can achieve this goal. Secretary Barrett and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to both of you. And we'll begin now with a 5-minute round. General Goldfein, these savings of $21 billion found in night court, is that within the Air Force or the total defense budget?
Air Force, and it's over the whole FYDP.
Okay. Well, in doing what you had to do with the budget submission, and understanding that you had to make some tough decisions, where do you see the most risk in this budget?
So I think the two hardest decisions we made at Endgame were two weapon systems that we're asking to retire some number of them. And I'll talk about both, KC-135s, KC-10s, and also the A-10. When it came to the KC-135 and the tanker portfolio, this is the classic tension between a combatant commander that's looking at a 2-year problem to solve and a service chief that's trying to build a force that wins in 2030. That tension has always been there, and it always will be there. So when we looked across the portfolio of tankers, the congressional mandate is that we never go below 479. Secretary Mattis used to say, hey, before anybody says the risk word, you have to answer 3 questions. To who, for how long, and what is your mitigation? This is risk to the combatant commander who testified about that risk. This is going to be until the KC-46 comes online, which we expect to be in 23 to 24. And our mitigation is that the retirement we're asking for in the KC-135 represents 3% of the overall KC-135 fleet. And we have committed to the combatant commander and the Secretary of Defense that if we go to a high-end contingency, we will put every KC-46 we have into the fight. We won't use it for day-to-day operations, but it will be made available for a contingency. So we think it's a reasonable risk portfolio going forward. And on the A-10, as we looked at that right at endgame, on the A-10, we are putting almost $1 billion into that weapon system, about $880 million to re-wing, new avionics, and we're going to keep that weapon system flying, albeit with smaller numbers, well into the 2030s. So those are the two areas that I think are significant risk.
On the tankers, what will happen between 2021 and 2023?
Sir, we'll manage the force like we do all other areas where we have shortfalls. So what the TRANSCOM commander was laying out for you was the stacked requirements that he has to deal with day to day. And so just like we are short in bombers, fighters, tankers, ISR, command and control, the Secretary of Defense managed those forces against all of the demand signal, and in certain areas he tells the combatant commanders they can have less of what they're asking for. We will do the same thing in the tanker force between now and when the KC-46 comes online.
Secretary Barrett, with a budget decrease of approximately $12 billion from last year, are you comfortable with how the funding is allocated among personnel, equipment modernization, and operations and maintenance?
Senator, while we would like very much, of course, to have more funds, the reality is with these funds we believe that the allocation is appropriately designed.
General Goldfein, the Air Force requires 72 fighter aircraft per year. To begin to recap, it's nearly 30-year-old on average aircraft. General Goldfein, you've said this is a minimum. When do you believe we'll be able to achieve this number, and given the importance of extending the range of our aircraft and any potential conflict and the comments from TRANSCOM, how do you balance the current air? Well, you've spoken about the air refueling already, but if you would comment on the first portion of that question.
Yes, sir. So 72 is the number we need to be able to drive aircraft age down to about a 17 to 18-year average age, which we think is sustainable. Without the 3 to 5% growth or some growth in the budget, to be honest with you, sir, I don't know at what point we would ever get to 72 fighters a year. I will thank this committee, though, because there was some lean years there where we were buying, 20 to 30 airplanes total in several years. And so at least we're up into the 50s and the 60s now. So we're doing better, but I don't know at what point we'll get to the 72 aircraft per year if the budget stays flat.
Thank you very much. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to follow up a bit on the tanker issue. First, thank you for your thoughtful response, General. It very insightful. But, Madam Secretary, I presume that you are really focused on getting the KC-46 in the air and operational, working with the contractor Boeing. Can you give us some insights as to what you're doing? Can we be confident that in 2023 is fully operational?
We're meeting every day on that topic. It is really one of the highest priorities in the building, including meetings just yesterday afternoon. The chief has been very much involved as well and working directly with the company. At the moment, it is not meeting all the requirements. It is able to be used for passenger transport, for cargo transport, and for aeromedical evacuation purposes, and for some training. But we do look forward to having the remote visual system repaired to be usable, and that we're looking to have some solution even by the end of this month on a way forward. And the chief has been very much involved with that.
And General, I understand from your response to Chairman Wicker that part of the contingency plan would be to essentially put the KC-46 in operation if there was a stress to the system. And doing the numbers, would that give us the capacity to engage in a significant contingency operation?
Sir, it would definitely reduce the risk. I think the Transcom commander, if he was here, to tell you that we are living every day with the tanker shortage, and the KC-46 is not going to completely fill that in. However, because we're buying at 12, 15 per year, every one of those tankers with crews would be made available in a high-end contingency. So it would certainly be able to overcome, for that period of time that we use them, the retirement that we're asking for. And if I could just add on to
Yes,
Secretary,
sir, please.
To Secretary Barrett's point, you know, I wrote a letter to the CEO 3 days, and he came to see me, Mr. Calhoun, and he committed to me that the KC-46 was his top military priority, and he was going to do what was required to fix it. I have seen a change in the behavior of that company since he took over. And so that's why we're more confident sitting here today that we have a serious fix on the table. And we're in final negotiations, so we can't go into any more detail than that. But I will say that it's looking better today than it was even 6 months ago.
But just to follow up, and I have no expertise with aircraft as you do, but today we will not use them in operational because of the visual system, et cetera. But in a contingency operation, we're prepared to use them. Would that require significant modifications of the way the aircraft approaching to refuel would operate? Again, are we just at this point being abundantly cautious, or there's some still profound problems with the system?
No, sir, there's profound problems with the system at the point where I would not be comfortable putting them into.
So this would be this contingency would be, listen, we've got no other choice. We've got to throw these in the mix, but it's going to be a, hope for the best.
Yes, sir, and I'll tell you, I've been pulled out of a lot of really bad places by some courageous tanker crews, really low on gas. We want that tanker to be able to plug that receiver.
That's it. We had a chance, General, to speak yesterday about the sustainment cost of the F-35. And I think most people would be, I know I was a bit surprised when the current sustainment cost is about $39,000 an hour. I know you're working to get it down, but that raises the question of, can we afford to buy more aircraft if we can't afford to fly them? And can you comment briefly, very briefly, on sustainment costs?
I can, sir. I met with all of the CEOs, to include Lockheed Martin and all of the subcontractors, and I told them in no uncertain terms, both as the largest customer, as a joint chief that represents my fellow chiefs who also have bought this aircraft, and my international air chiefs who have bought onto this. The current flying hour costs are unsustainable. We met. I gave them a list of requirements. They did a 180-day sprint with the Joint Program Office. I then went down and spent an entire day at Lockheed Martin with leadership there and brought 27 stars with me. We went through a full day, and like what we've seen in Boeing, I believe Lockheed Martin has taken a serious look at sustainment costs, and their plan right now is to lower sustainment costs to $25,000 per hour by 2025, and we're going to hold them to that.
Well, we're going to keep watch on your efforts and wish you well. And I will submit a question to the record, General, with respect to the MQ-9 industrial base. We talked about it yesterday. We looked, and it appears to us that after FY20, there's no MQ-9s in the budget, and we just want to get a better picture of where we're going with that asset. And I'll send it for the record. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr.
General, what can the KC-46 not do in the next 2 years?
For normal refueling, what's happening with the remote visual system is a couple things. One, we're having the boom operator struggles to see about the last 10 feet between the boom and the aircraft, right? It's a focus issue on how the system was designed. And so what's happening then is you start, there's the high potential for striking the aircraft around the receptacle if you can't actually see it very closely at endgame. That, as you might imagine, is not a good thing. So while I would accept that with a highly trained crew in a high-end contingency, I would not accept that for day-to-day operations. And this is a hardware problem requiring a hardware fix.
Thank you. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Barrett, General Goldfein, first of all, thank you so much for your service to this country. I also want to express my appreciation for the robust way this budget funds nuclear modernization. I want to thank you both for the attention that the Air Force has paid to the rebuilding of Offutt Air Force Base as well. Your teams have been valuable partners as we have worked together to secure the funds necessary to repair, replace, and rebuild following the historic flooding that occurred in Nebraska a year ago. Secretary Barrett, the 55th Wing is the #1 provider of large fixed-wing Air Force ISR in the nation. This is a capability that is in constant demand. I hear it from our combatant commanders. And the newly contested environments that we are faced with now mean that we need to think creatively about integrating these platforms like the RC-135 into future networks. Given that fact, how are you working to ensure the continued capability of the RC-135 as we look into the future time frame?
Thank you, Senator. The RC-135 is pivotal to our ISR capabilities, and as you know, training capability was lost during the floods at Offutt. So we want to thank you for the funding to help get that back up so that we can renew the training. And the other key thing that is happening with that platform and others is the computer connectedness, building that as an element, a node on the network for our combatants.
The Air Force laid out a future roadmap for the ISR mission in the ISR Dominance Flight Plan, and what progress has been made in implementing the points of that plan? Okay. General.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. The most progress we've done is actually how we've tied the distributed ground system, where we do all the analytical work in the ISR, into this battlefield network, this advanced battle management. Because, you know, it used to be that we would have platform sensors of weapons from all of our services that were operating independently, and then the universal translator across weapon systems was a phone or a chat room operating at human speeds. That's not going to work in the next fight. We've got to be able to work seamlessly at machine speeds, and that's what Advanced Battle Management System does. And the RC-135 is a significant player in that.
You had mentioned the ABMS and the JADC2, and the FY21 budget makes significant investments in that next generation networking capability. How's the Air Force working to ensure integration of existing platforms with these new capabilities that are coming online?
Yes, ma'am. That is the foundation of this, is how do we take existing capabilities, in addition to new capabilities, and connect them in. When this committee supported our move from Joint STARS into a battlefield network solution for the future, we took those savings and we put it into demonstrations and connected capability that is no longer PowerPoint slides with lightning bolts that are aspirational. We turned this into real capability. We're no longer talking about cloud capability. We actually built a cloud. We contracted with industry, and all the services are connected in. We're not just talking about common data architecture. We built unified data library, and now we're connecting and sharing. Every 4 months, we connect portions of the enterprise, and we do a demonstration, and we operate at machine speeds. And what we're learning is that each of the weapon systems that we're connecting now jumps in its capability when you can connect it into a common architecture.
Thank you. Secretary Barrett, the Air Force is still conducting an analysis of alternatives, and I believe this is the second study that we've had for that, for the recapitalization of the E-4B. It's my understanding that the AOA will conclude soon. What is the Air Force's plan to move forward after the AOA finishes? I ask this because this has been an issue of constant study, and I believe the first AOA was directed back in 2008. The challenges of maintaining that outdated airframe are only getting harder, and I think it's vital that the Air Force move forward after this AOA concludes, and this issue shouldn't be studied indefinitely. Can you speak to this, please?
We've found that sometimes studies are an never-ending process. I can assure you that we will review that study at its conclusion and make a decision based on its recommendations.
We always want to make sure that we have all the information available at the time, but we do need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. And General Goldfein, we appreciate your service, and we'll miss you, even though you may not miss us in these hearings. I want to go back to the KC-46 because that's a continuing concern for us in New Hampshire with 157th Air Refueling Wing, and we lost our last KC-135s over a year ago now. And while the 46s have replaced them, and we're seeing the planes come in, and we hope to have all 12 new tankers by this summer, as you know, they're not flying, and we're hearing from our Air Guard that they would like to fly some missions. So I have two questions. The first is the biggest challenge still remaining the remote vision system? And do you have any sense from Boeing, based on your communications back in January, that when this is going to get resolved and how long it will take to address that in the tankers that have already been put out?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. So right now we're in final negotiations with the company on the fix, so I've got to be a little careful about how much detail I go into. But I did have a follow-up conversation with the CEO, and told him that not only the quality of a serious hardware fix is important, but also time. Because the longer we wait to get that aircraft operational, the longer we're having to extend KC-135s, KC-10s, and it continues to add up. So we're going to be holding them not only to a really serious fix, but also to time. And right now we're targeting initially about the 23 to 24 time frame to have the fix in place and operational. And then it'll be some kind of retrofit timeline that we'll have to work.
So that's significant.
It is.
I know that last week Dr. Will Roper testified that, and General Lyons said that we're below the mark on both tanker capacity and tanker capability right now. So if we're talking about 3 or 4 years before we're going to get up to capacity, what are we assuming is going to happen with the units like the 157 that would like to do missions, and are there other things that they can do as we look at the potential to utilize the KC-46 for medical missions or other things?
Yes, ma'am. So 2 missions that we're in the process of certifying now. It can do lift. We bought it for not heavy lift, but it can do lift missions, and it can also do aeromedical. We're still in the process of certifying it for that. As soon as it's certified that, we'll start using it for those missions as we then go into the long-term fix for the remote visual system. And to your units, as you know, we took the active duty manpower out of the total force unit and moved it. Our plan is to have that available right now for the tankers that are operational. And then as soon as we get the KC-46 online and the fix is in place, that manpower comes back.
So that manpower is not going to come back until 23, 24?
As soon as we can get a fix, and I will just tell you that the Boeing has heard loud and clear that time is of the essence.
3 or 4 years doesn't sound like time is of the essence to me. So I hope that this committee will do what we can to address that as well, because that's unacceptable. I mean, it really is. Secretary Barrett, I want to go back to PFAS, which you mentioned in your opening statement, which we know is a concern. And again, I appreciate the commitment that the Air Force has made to address the situation at the former Pease Air Force Base. But I wonder if you have gotten an update from the Navy, who is the lead in developing a fluorine-free firefighting foam, and where they are in that. The NDAA that we passed this year said that we needed to phase out all of the fluorine-containing foam by 2024. Do you know where we are in that?
I know the Navy is working and doing experiments with other foam additives. They have not yet it seems, come upon a solution that meets the requirements to extinguish fires, intense fires in contained areas. And of course, the Navy is very concerned about fires aboard ships, so they're very attentive to right now, so far, the PFAS formula is the one that is most effective at fire extinguishing. We have completed, we no longer use the PFAS in our training. When we do use any containing product, we contain it, and we are working diligently to clean up the problem that has been caused by the Air Force, as every community around the country has been doing. But we take it very seriously. The health and safety of our communities is among the most important things that we work with.
Thank you. My time is up, but I just want to also thank you for committing, as did former Secretary Wilson, to address the occupational health study at Pease. And if there are more resources needed and we can be helpful with that, I hope you will share that with our office.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Cotton.
Secretary Barrett, General Goldfein, thank you for your appearance here again today. General Goldfein, I want to go back to something you said in your opening statement. I want to see if we can put it a little more bluntly and just not beat around the bush on it. You and Secretary Barrett and your whole team have done a lot to try to identify what our Air Force needs to fight the future fight. And that's going to require some divestment, some cuts in current programs. And the issue is that over here in current programs, you got a bunch of stuff that flies around right now that we can all see. Or maybe more importantly, that sits on the ground in our states and employs people in our states. And over here, you have a bunch of stuff that is super secret, very classified, very cutting edge, that we can't see. Is that right? So you're talking about making cuts to the stuff that we can see and spending money on the stuff we can't see. Is that the crux of the matter that you're getting at?
Yes, sir.
I don't think anyone doubts that we need all this super secret stuff over here. We've had a number of hearings on it. We created a space force in part to address it. I just think it's important that we lay that out there and make it very plain, so when we get down to brass tacks on the NDAA or we get down to brass tacks on the defense spending bill, that we all on this panel remember, and that the other senators in the Senate remember, that the secret stuff is very needful. And the public stuff that has been with us for a long time and very comfortable may need to be trimmed back to pay for the secret stuff. And that's not a strategy issue. That's a political issue for all of us to deal with. And that's not endorsing any single kind of cut that you may have to make here or any single kind of program you may spend here. We may have different thoughts on that. We may want to tinker around the edges. But I think it's really clear that we just be upfront about the dilemma that the Air Force faces, which is at root a political dilemma that we all should handle in a responsible and sober fashion given the threats that we face in the future.
Thanks, sir.
I now want to speak about spectrum, specifically the mid-band spectrum. Secretary Esper said that DoD is willing to explore sharing that spectrum, and we know that some of your systems like AWACS operate there. Can you talk to us about what mid-band capabilities that you're concerned about and how critical the spectrum is to those capabilities? I'll throw that open to either one of you that want to go.
Yes, sir. And I'll back up exactly what Secretary Esper says. We cannot vacate, but we can look at sharing. It does affect, in the mid-band, our AWACS and other command and control assets, and it certainly impacts where we're going with battlefield networks. But we do think that there's a strategy ahead for sharing.
So talk to us a little bit more about what not vacating but sharing would look like.
Meaning we've still got to, we have to operate in that spectrum. So there may be ways to parcel and share some portions of it, but we cannot leave it. And there are some that are asking us to give that up, and that is not something I could ever advise you to do.
Okay. Secretary Barrett, did you want to?
I would just say that sharing it has to be, the only sharing we can do is a sharing where the fidelity of our signals is not intruded. So they have to, what use others would have of it can only be made where it does not intrude in the signal that we're using.
Okay. Any thoughts on kind of costs we're looking at here?
So I know that they're taking a look at it. I've not seen any costs that I could give you yet. We can take that one for the record if you like. Yeah, please do. Secretary Barrett, did you want to add? Okay.
One final question that's a related point. Unfortunately, some of our allies are moving forward with Huawei products in developing their 5G wireless systems, even in countries where we have some of your airmen positioned. What are your concerns about their personal and operational security if the countries in which they are based are developing 5G systems using Huawei products?
It's a great disappointment to have allies that are using Huawei. Alternatively, we have not been forthcoming with good alternatives to the Huawei system, so we need to up our game to have as competitive a system, a more competitive system, so that we are providing that. But it does put our signals at risk and our airmen at risk.
Yeah, I agree that I'll say that we have not been particularly effective at providing alternatives. I mean, we, as I would say, the entire West, United States government, allied governments, and our businesses, although I would say in all their defenses, it's hard to compete against a company like Huawei, which is an arm of the Chinese Communist Party and enjoys effectively unlimited subsidies. So when our allies are saying things like, well, we have to go with a reasonable cost provider, the only reason Huawei is a reasonable cost provider is not that they are the best company or they have the brightest minds or the most effective manufacturing techniques. It's because their bills are paid by the Chinese Communist Party. And that's something that we as policymakers should take into account when we're trying to identify possible alternatives. General, I know this is your last posture hearing. Maybe it won't be your last hearing. I'm sure you hope it is. But if it's not, it's been an honor to be able to serve with you these last few years, and we thank you for your service to the nation.
General, we customarily invite retired experts with a lot of wisdom to come back. So I dare say this will not be your last hearing, but it will be on a voluntary basis. Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to join in expressing my appreciation and thanks. I'm sure everybody on the committee shares it for your extraordinary service to our nation, and look forward to seeing you back again voluntarily. Madam Secretary, I appreciate your focus on PFAS contamination and leading that effort. Is there a specific budget item for cleanup involving Air Force bases and facilities?
Senator Blumenthal, we have spent almost $500 million in cleanup to date, and will continue. I don't know what the exact number is for this year, but we will continue that cleanup effort and work with the communities for cleanup.
Maybe you could provide that number.
Mm-hmm.
And the second point on this issue, have you made a recommendation to the FAA that they eliminate their current requirement, as I understand it, that PFAS be used in the firefighting foam on airports, civilian airports around the country?
We have not made that recommendation to the FAA.
Would you make it?
Yeah.
Thank
Looks like something we'd look at. Let me say that.
Thank you. I hope you will look at it and make that recommendation, because I think it could be important in speeding their consideration of ending the PFAS requirement. I am very interested in the discussion that you had with Senator Cotton about the classification issue. I will just restate, you may have heard me say it in our classified briefings, that the American public needs and deserves to know more so that it can appreciate the threats to the nation and what you are doing to address those threats. And I share your view that a lot of the super secret stuff is vitally important. The nation needs to understand more about it, and I think could well be told more about it without compromising our security. I want to go from the super secret to the more mundane at the Air National Guard in Connecticut, where NP 2000 propellers are currently in use. I'm sure you're familiar with this issue because it is long-standing. The replacement of those legacy propellers is essential to the safety, literally the safety, of the men and women of our Air National Guard who fly those C-130H aircraft. Can the replacement of those propellers be expedited and accelerated, General?
Yeah, thank you, sir. And I'll tell you, I've been down there. I've looked at the propeller. I've watched it going in. It's an excellent propeller. And we have, as you know, replaced all of the pre-1971 C-130H engines with that new propeller. At the same time, on the post-1971, we've adjusted our overhaul and our depot procedures to cover the safety issues associated with the older propeller. But we are studying and looking at whether we want to look at the MP2000 for expanded use, and we look forward to working with you on that.
I hope that we can follow up on that issue. I don't have time to cover it fully here, but I hope that we can talk more about it.
Sure.
On, again, the Air National Guard at Bradley, as you may know, $60 million has been invested in that Air National Guard base, and yet the C-130H modernization is going to be impaired by the diversion of $169 million going to the border wall instead of 2 cargo planes for that base. And I want to know what can be done to overcome the obstacles that are created. These obstacles are presented in longer form by a letter that I've received from General Evon of our Connecticut Air National Guard, the Adjutant General. I'd like to put it in the record if there's no objection, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
I'm sure you're familiar with this situation, so I'd like to ask you what is the impact of diverting $169 million of C-130J procurement?
Sir, we're working through all of the mitigation efforts relative to the money that's gone towards the wall. I think the best I could tell you is that, you know, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was asked to describe the impact, his answer was this amount of dollars relative to the strategic immediate defense of the nation did not have a significant impact, I believe were his words. And so that's where we as Joint Chiefs are now relative to that issue.
Finally, although my time has expired, I'd like to ask a question for the record, not to be answered here, but in writing, about also the impact on the F-35 program of apparently diverting money from the 48 F-35 requested in the budget. I know that you've put 12 additional F-35 aircraft on the unfunded priorities list. I think that we need to explore what the impact's going to be on procurement timelines in that program. Senator Reid has rightly raised the issue of the sustainment costs, but the building and manufacturing costs, I think, also need to be considered. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal, and we'll look forward to that answer on the record. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Barrett. Good to see you, as always, and General Goldfein. Thank you very much for your service. We certainly do appreciate it. As we just spoke, General Goldfein, I'd like to address the issue of the KC-135s. A lot of discussion here today about the 46s and the 135s. And I'd like for you to state, just so the folks back home in Iowa understand where we sit. The 185th Air National Guard, the Air Refueling Wing, is one of the highest performing units in all of the Air National Guard. And if you could just explain for those folks where they sit with their KC-135s, and at this point we're a little bit thankful we don't have the 46s right now, so thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I can tell you that there'll be no impact or no change to the 185th in terms of the 135s relative to the planned retirements.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we discussed that with Transcom last week as well. I think many of us are very, very concerned about that. And then how we do get to a point where we're transitioning to those 46s. And that's yet to be seen, but we do appreciate your attention to that matter. Secretary Barrett, so we are in an exciting time where we have a lot of new and emerging technologies out there, and these technologies can augment our Air Force capabilities, which will help us anticipate and respond to various threats. And so we are pretty lucky that tech development in our civilian sector has boomed, and the Air Force now has a new way of taking a look at some of this technology, and as we move into acquisitions, it's kind of like an Air Force Shark Tank. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that and how that is developing and how we're able to see some of those technologies and apply them to today's modern Air Force?
Thank you very much, Senator. In fact, just last week I participated as a judge we both participated as judges in Spark Tank, which was an evaluation of innovations that members of the air staff throughout the Air Force had come forward with ideas that were money-saving or new inventions, new capabilities. That's inside the Air Force. In addition, we're working very closely with pitch days for businesses and innovations outside of the Air Force. Both of these are developments, ideas from the creative mind of Dr. Will Roper in acquisitions to think of ways of inspiring innovation and creativity and rewarding people that are initiating new ideas. So both internally within the Air Force, externally to small companies outside who have maybe in the past been found doing business with the Department of Defense daunting, but are excited about presenting their technologies. And instead of having months and years to get a contract with the Defense Department, one participant described it as they can get a contract from the Defense Department faster than they can order a beer in New York City. So there are some new processes that inspire people to want to do business with the Defense Department, especially with new technologies and innovations.
That's outstanding. Can you describe some of the businesses that are taking advantage? Are they large businesses, small businesses?
These are all, almost all very small businesses or small businesses with good ideas. And the internal ones were people that saw damage being done to equipment and to stores and figuring out a way of loading cargo aircraft without doing damage. People that saw in test ranges the ability to move the threat that had been positioned. There were 4 standing threats, but much easier, much better training if they can move those threats. And so there are a number of great ideas of ways to make the training better, cut costs, reduce waste, and have a better Air Force.
So you do believe this is a positive step forward
Absolutely.
in acquisitions? Okay.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. And just very briefly, General Goldfein, autonomy. We've been discussing this with your colleagues in the Navy as well. The Air Force labs also do great work in this area. Can you very briefly explain some of the technologies we're seeing come from that?
I'll describe one very quickly, Skyborg, which is the Valkyrie drone system that we use successfully in the upcoming demonstration in April. We're going to use it to be a universal translator between 5th-gen capability and Navy and Army. And so loyal wingman technology, where the manned platform and the unmanned platform are actually working as a team, is where our future lies.
Excellent. And my time has expired, but I'd love to visit more about that at another point. Thank you, General Goldfein, for your service. We certainly do appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. Senator Heinrich.
Secretary General, Space Force Vice Commander Lieutenant General David Thompson recently indicated that the U.S. Space Force will propose the consolidation of current space acquisition organizations under an entity called Space Systems Command. As you're aware, Congress specifically mandated that the Space Rapid Capabilities Office act as an independent agency. We did that to ensure that it continues to be able to adapt and innovate quickly. What consequences would this kind of consolidation have on the organization's ability to innovate as Congress intended?
Our mission will be to design the system so that we optimize creativity and adoption of technology in the use of our space assets.
So, I'm sorry, say that again.
We'll be designing things with the intent to have optimized technology for our space resources.
So you think by consolidating Space RCO into this broader capabilities office, you're actually going to be improving their ability to?
So I'm not speaking to specifically that consolidation, with which I'm not.
Because my
thoroughly
concern is that one of the reasons why Congress
You have
has
it?
historically, General, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes, sir.
We've been trying to protect this entity because it innovates quickly, and bureaucracy has a tendency to want to swallow things that innovate quickly.
Yes, sir. Amen. You know what? The Secretary's direction to us has been crystal clear. While there will be a lot of discussions about administrivia and bureaucracy, our job is to deliver capability and deliver it fast at the speed of relevance, because that's exactly what the threat countries are doing. And Space RCO, as designed, and you had a huge hand in putting that together, it needs to stay independent, and it needs to be able to move fast without a lot of, lines and boxes that are all, get a chance to vote on what they're doing. So we specifically built that on the model of our Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office. Same board procedures, same authorities to move fast, and so we want to keep it independent.
That was the answer I was hoping I might hear. I want to move on to PFAS, and Secretary Barrett, I don't know how to say this other than I am, I heard you earlier say that you're working with communities, but in the case of Clovis, New Mexico, I'm sort of beyond frustrated by the utter lack of communication and any level of coordination at this point between Air Force leadership and local government elected officials for the city of Clovis. We recently received a response letter to the entire delegation. It was wholly inadequate. This is a community that has bent over backwards for decades with great pride to host the Air Force in their community, and they feel like they're getting absolutely stonewalled right now. So I want to ask you if I can have your commitment that you will direct whoever the appropriate Air Force personnel are to establish direct communications with local officials in Clovis to work together to remedy the PFAS situation there.
You have my commitment.
Thank you very much. I also want to ask you, with regard to the authorities that were given to the Air Force in the most recent NDAA, if you will work with New Mexico and state and local officials to find a permanent PFAS solution and actually use those authorities that Congress gave the Air Force in the NDAA.
We are doing research now, and we'll continue to do that. It is a Navy lead, but the Air Force is working it as well.
Because one of the things we did when this issue popped up is ask the former secretary, what can you do and what can't you do? Mm-hmm. And she was very blunt about what she couldn't do. We changed much of that in the NDAA, and we'd like to see you use those authorities. I want to move on to MQ-9s, and Congress obviously appropriated a lot of money for MQ-9 training. That money was taken by the President to pay for third-century technology being deployed along our southern border. I want to know what the plan is, because these folks are training in very substandard conditions over a sinkhole in a building that couldn't pass code enforcement in a third world country.
Yeah, sir, we're working through the mitigation right now. As you know, it's been fairly recent that we're working our way through this. I just go back to the question we were asked as Joint Chiefs, which is, describe the impact relative to defending the nation and the immediate significant strategic impacts, and that's where the chairman gave his answer, and so that's where the Joint Chiefs are right now.
Yeah, I understand the strategic impacts. I think it's just reprehensible when you walk through that facility to see our best and brightest training in a facility that is not safe, that you couldn't get to pass code in any community in the United States where there's duct tape on the walls, and these are our best and brightest.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here, both of you for your service. A special thank you to General Goldfein again. I never cease being amazed at the talent that replaces really good talent, but I also never cease being concerned by the loss of excellent talent, and I am concerned but grateful to you for your service. And also, thank you for last week. I did take advantage of the invitation to participate in the classified discussion, and I would encourage all of my colleagues who have not taken advantage of that to do that. It was very helpful. It created a lot of answers, but a lot of questions as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to just throw out a few of them and let you, each of you, respond, if you will. With regard to the here to there strategy, and you referenced, I think, quoting General Mattis, the risk word, and talk a little bit about it. But in my specific, parochial interest, of course, is the ISR mission, specifically the Global Hawk Wing at Grand Forks, to some degree as well the MQ-9s, but particularly the Global Hawk Wing at Grand Forks, and the retirement of the Block 20s and Block 30s at Beale, and how that affects the folks in Grand Forks and in North Dakota. And would love to hear anything you could tell us and tell them about the future of that base and its mission. Also, while you're talking about that, maybe ask the question about the Arctic and the Arctic fight. And we've had a lot of discussions in this room with others as well, but would give you the opportunity as well to maybe give us some insight into what's being planned.
Yes, sir. I'll do ISR, and then the Secretary will take Arctic. On the ISR portfolio, so as you saw when we sat down, there are certain capabilities that we're bringing together in the classified realm, and we're connecting capabilities that today are not connected. So because almost every platform out there, whether it flies, orbits, submerges, runs, rolls, it's a sensor. But we haven't been able to tie together those sensors to be able to fuse data in ways that can make this common operational picture. And so now as we tie things together, we're finding that we get far greater fidelity on what it is that we're doing. So combination of space capabilities, missions that we're doing in the air today that we're migrating into space, classified capabilities, and pulling these all together with common digital engineering and common data architecture is actually improving our ISR and allow us now to take some risk when it comes to individual platforms. That's our strategy for the future.
So could you expand a little bit then on what the future for Grand Forks specifically may look like in the light of this?
So what you'll see in this budget is a retirement of the older Global Hawks. And with all of these, we want to make sure that we work with the communities and with you, sir, and with all of the senators to make sure that we minimize impact on the base as we go forward. Because Grand Forks, like many other bases, is key strategic terrain. It's key to the Arctic strategy because of its location. It also supports some of our ground-based intercept radar feeds that are so important to us. So we want to make sure we mitigate that the impacts to Grand Forks.
Thank you. Madam Secretary.
The Arctic is of increasing importance to the United States, and it's been important for a long time, but ever more increasing now. As a result, the Arctic strategy is a key element of the Air Force and the Department of Defense's effort. But the Air Force, more than other elements, because 80% of the Arctic defense is provided by the Air Force or Department of Air Force elements. You know that from my background, I've paid quite a bit of attention to the Arctic. One of my first visits was to Thule. I spent time in Finland, and later this week I will be visiting the Minot operations, and later this month be in Alaska, also looking at those facilities. So it is a very important topic of increasing importance to us.
Thank you. In my remaining seconds, I might just ask, in general, as we look at the DoD budget, and I know you have a heart for a discussion about the pass-through part of your budget and how that may warp how people view the budget. I mean, the Air Force always seems to me, with its being the tip of the spear, having the highest priority in DoD operations, to sort of be at the short end of the stick budget-wise. I mean, are you generally satisfied with what we have in terms of the entire budget for the Air Force?
Well, we have to live within the top line, so we have had to make a lot of trades that we wish we wouldn't have to. And the pass-through is an especially disconcerting matter because it does create a misperception. We are looking at that as something that we will come to Congress with a proposal in the next budget on how that should be treated in recognition of a Space Force and the reconstruction that will be occurring through the Department of the Air Force.
It's a conversation whose time has come. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our witnesses. Thank you for your testimony today. And General Goldfein, I'd like to join some of my colleagues in wishing you all the best in the years ahead. It's been a pleasure working with you these past years, and we'll look forward to your next adventure, whatever that may be. Secretary Barrett, I'd like to discuss the issue of PFAS with you, as several of my colleagues have mentioned. As you know, PFAS is very dangerous to human health, and the contamination has been identified at the former Air Force Base at Wordsmith in Oscoda, Michigan. It's something you and I have discussed many times in my office, and I appreciate your openness to that discussion. Also have discussed this with Assistant Secretary Henderson, who visited the former base on my invitation, and we have also discussed it at a great deal. And I want to just say I appreciate your recent letter confirming that a little over $13 million will be going towards cleanup at Wordsmith. That is $13 million out of the $60 million that we appropriated for the country, so appreciate that commitment to the former base. My question to you is, could you provide me an update on how the remediation money is going to be spent, and will that have an impact on the timeline at the former Wordsmith Air Force Base?
Senator, I don't know the sequence of the spending and the impact on Wordsmith, but I know that we are working closely with the communities. Our mission is to preserve and protect the safety and health and to involve all of government so that we have solutions that engage with the needs of the community as well.
Well, if I may ask if you could have someone get back to us as to specifically how you see that money spent and what the timeline would be. It certainly would be very much appreciated by the community. The community appreciates the additional resources, and they're anxious to see what the details are regarding the money. Secretary Barrett, I also would like to talk to you a little bit about F-35 basing decision, something we have also talked about a great deal, and the basing of F-35s at the Selfridge Air National Guard Base in Michigan. And since we have been in these discussions, President Trump has made a number of comments, and I'd like to get an update, if I could, from you. President Trump recently said, and I'm going to quote from President Trump, and that's why we're giving strong consideration to deploying some of our mighty F-35s to Selfridge Air National Guard Base, and you know what that means, right? You know what that means. That's a big deal. He goes on to say, quote, so Selfridge, you're going to see a lot of very fast planes. Actually, they're totally stealth, so maybe you won't see them coming in, okay? You won't see them come in, but they're coming in, end of quote. That certainly got a lot of folks very interested in Macomb County, especially in Michigan. And I know the Air Force recently finalized the environmental impact statement relating to the basing decision, so I know the choice is with you. If you could just provide us an update on the Air National Guard's F-35 basing process, where we are on it.
Yes, I think, as we've discussed, there is a very deliberate process with criteria and a down-select process, and that we're in that process now, and therefore it's inappropriate for me to go into detail about the participants in the search, but we are going through a very deliberative and pre-established and approved. That does include an evaluation of the environmental impact, the costs that are going to be required, the facilities that are there, and we are looking at the community interest and involvement.
But the environmental impact study has been finalized, so you're well down the path.
Yeah, and comparing those of the various contestant
Great. Thank you.
bases.
The last question, I'm concerned about the recent reprogramming of the $1.3 billion from the National Guard and Reserve Equipment account that was reprogrammed to support the construction of the southern border wall. As both of you know, that funding provides the National Guard resources to mitigate key readiness shortfalls. Two specific programs that benefit from those funds that are being shifted to the southern wall our MQ-9 upgrades to support domestic operations and the KC-135 modification to improve survivability. Those are 2 units or 2 platforms that we have in Michigan. The 127th Wing operates 8 KC-135s. The 110th Wing supports MQ-9. And they're both, as we discussed here today already, in high demand and play a very, very important role in national defense. That makes me skeptical as to the impact on readiness. So will the Air Force reprioritize how it approaches National Guard modernization priorities when these funds have been reprogrammed away from key National Guard units?
Do you want to go for that? Senator, we'll be evaluating the impact. All of the deferred projects are important, but the President has declared an emergency on the southern border. The Chairman has indicated there is no immediate significant strategic diminution of readiness as a result of this transition, but the application of reassigning the resources is nothing further is expected beyond what has been announced.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Senator McSally.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Perdue, you had scooted away from the dais, and I was looking for you.
Well, first of all, I've used 5 seconds now already, so.
Reset the clock.
Sorry. Oh. I want these two to know, I'm going to say this for public record, they know personally, privately, how much I personally think of each of them in their careers and appreciate so much each of them individually. You guys are at the turning point in the U.S. military right now in so many ways. I just have 3 issues I want to get at real quick, but just 2 quick questions. One is, I think this whole thing that you're in the middle of, this transition, is what we've already said, visible current capability versus classified replacement capability. Obsolescence. We know we have maturing assets all over the Air Force. I'm very concerned about one specific thing I'll get at in just a second. The second thing, in terms of the JSTARS capability moving to an ABMS, picking up ABMS capability, picking up the JSTARS capability, is this whole development of new technology versus an old acquisition structure. You've got AI in here, and AI, as I understand it, it's machine learning, so the more data you give it, the faster it learns. Well, that doesn't necessarily fit an acquisition structure. So Will Roper, just recently, he's the acquisition chief, as you know, Chief. We've come so far in ABMS that we realize it's bigger than just replacing the capability that JSTARS provides. If you get ABMS right, you just built the military's Internet of Things. That's super exciting, et cetera. But this does not fit the traditional acquisition structure. The third thing is, how do we interact? Given all that, Congress is funding. We have an oversight called the NDAA. We try to give direction. We don't want to become bureaucratic. But right now, I'm very concerned. So in the first few months, you've had one demonstration in December. You got another one coming in April. My concern is that in the first 2 gates we had, I think it was August 30th or somewhere in there, the AOA was to be completed. And within 6 months after that, Secretary, you're to give us an update, as I understand that. Now, I understand this is somewhat fast-moving. And then the next thing is a briefing in January of some sort here. I realize this is a classified topic, but Secretary, I mean, I need your commitment today that the Air Force will abide by the current NDAA, the public law that exists today that relates to JSTARS and ABMS, specifically Section 236 and Section 147, and that we can expect to receive the AOA, or analysis of alternatives, and the capability development document. Can you commit to that today?
I am not confident that I can commit to it today, but we'll evaluate it, and may I get back with you even later today?
Well, absolutely, but what we're talking about is a new NDAA here. We're preparing for the new NDAA. So if changes need to be made to the structure of oversight, now's the time. Mm-hmm. You're new in this. It's your first cycle. It's the Chief's last cycle, so we've got the best of both worlds here. But let's get this right, because we can't just – this can't be an acquisition process that we wake up in 3 years and realize it's 3X in cost and 10 years late. I mean, just to be blunt. And it's really unacceptable that we don't get these reports on time when we've asked for that, and we had commitments of predecessors to do that. The second thing, Chief, the events that we're doing now, the demonstrations, the capability that JSTARS has, the two I'm concerned about is GMTI, ground moving target indicators, as you've spoken before about, and then battle management. We get some feedback from other services that, well, we're headed in the wrong direction or we need to adapt this and so forth. Can you talk about specifically those two capabilities? And then what does that mean in terms of the organic force structure at Robbins to help facilitate the headquarters development there of ABMS?
Sure, I'll hit the last part first. There's no intent to reduce the size of the force at Robbins, and we're committed to working with you on that. When it comes to...
Sir, could I apologize to interrupt, but you're talking about the force of JSTARS, and there's a gap as JSTARS matures out and you replace it with ABMS. There is a gap of capability. We know it exists today. But in terms of organic force structure, I accept your answer. I appreciate that. Can you address the other part of that?
Yes, sir, but to the gap.
Yes, sir.
Once we determined that we could fly Joint Stars well into the late 20s and into 2030, that actually filled the gap. Okay. So this whole plan is to ensure there is no gap, because there can be no gap for the warfighter.
Very good.
But we have to ensure that we can get them this information on day one of the fight, which is, as you were very helpful to. What we're trying to do here is incredibly disruptive. And it's disruptive in the eyes of the adversary. And so what we did to bring on a new way, this goes to your point about the current acquisition system, we brought in 12 pioneers from industry and put them on an advanced battle management system. We have the designer of Uber on our payroll. And so we're using industry's best practices, and industry isn't here with us doing this. The next demonstration we're going to do at Nellis Air Force Base, where all the Joint Chiefs will go to it, we're going to be doing live fly connective capability at Yuma, at Eglin, off the shore, at White Sands, at Nellis Air Force Base. We're going to have 3 supported commanders, and we're going to have a number of firsts. And if we do this right, about 60% of it will work.
So will the next demonstration have GMTI and battle management demonstrated in that demonstration?
It will, but it will do it not from where we want to eventually take it.
Okay.
It will do it in an interim step.
Yes, sir.
And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Perdue. Next is Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I add my thanks to you, General, for your service and my best wishes on your impending retirement. Madam Secretary, I was pleased to hear about your pitch days, where you encourage small businesses to pitch their ideas. Where do these pitch days occur?
They've been taking place around the country. I attended one in San Francisco. They're in a variety of cities around the country.
Nothing in Hawaii yet?
Not that I know of, but we'll,
think about that.
Yeah, put that on the list.
I want to add my concerns to those expressed by some of my colleagues about the reprogramming of DoD money to go to the wall on the southern border. So I just want to express that. And at some point, I think it does have a negative impact on readiness and other aspects of what the DoD is supposed to be focused on. Madam Secretary, the National Defense Strategy highlights great power competition with China and Russia, and it includes North Korea, Iran, and transnational violent extremism. 4 of these 5 threats are in the Indo-Pacific AOR, and I'm glad to see the focus on the region given its growing importance to our national security. What concerns you most with regard to the Indo-Pacific region as the Secretary of the Air Force?
A key issue there is the vastness of the territory and logistics being prepared to station our capabilities through that area.
Yes, it is the biggest AOR. Do you believe then that additional assets and investments are needed for the Air Force to maintain its competitive advantage against our adversaries in this part of the region or this part of the world?
There is a significant review of what the positioning, how we are positioned for the greater peer threat.
And when is that review going to?
I think there's a continual review.
So do you think that this review will result in more concentration of certain assets in the Indo-Pacific Command area?
I don't want to predict the outcome of it, but I would anticipate that the realities will be a significant part of how those assets will be decided.
I hope so. General, do you agree?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. So the chairman is leading us through a global integrated exercises that's looking at global campaigns, because a China or a Russia campaign will not be confined within that geographic area of responsibility. So we're working our way through what does the command and control look like, which is why this JADC2 is so important for how we look at this new way of warfighting going forward. So we're doing that review now.
Thank you. Last fall, this is for Secretary Barrett, last fall the Air Force indicated Barking Sands Pacific Missile Range Facility in Kauai as the preferred location for a Pacific-based space control squadron operated by the Hawaii Air National Guard. And I haven't heard much else since that initial announcement. Can you advise what the status of the space control squadron is, and when will the unit be activated?
Senator, I don't know the answer to that. May I get
Yes.
back with you?
Thank you. So for both of you, as the Air Force prepares for a future possibility of conflict with a near-peer adversary, I understand you are investing in agile combat employment. Sorry, I thought my time was up, but it's not. Where you would launch, recover, and maintain aircraft away from main bases using partner nations' military fields or civilian airfields. Secretary Barrett, what nations in the Pacific theater, if any, have been approached thus far as possible locations for these agile combat employment teams and assets? Or if the General would like to respond? Either way.
May I ask the General?
Yes.
Well, I'd just say we're really blessed that my successor has been nominated publicly, and that's General Brown,
Yes.
who's the concern. And this is his concept of operations that he will no doubt, if confirmed, bring into the seat. And so I actually went to his Pacific Air Chiefs Conference, and this was a central topic of discussion. And I will tell you that from Philippines to Singapore to, I could go around the region, and all of them are talking about this new concept of employment.
Great. We'll have an opportunity to talk with General Brown about that. General Goldfein, what are your thoughts on having the C-17s at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam under operational control of Indo-PACOM versus TRANSCOM?
I think the decision has been made to actually chop all of the strategic lift to TRANSCOM for the purposes of global mobility. And this is part of the global integrated exercise. We've just been working through this as well in Central Command as well. So TRANSCOM, through the last directive from the chairman, has been given operational control of strategic lift. And so General Lyons is the one that manages that for the globe.
Okay. I do have some questions for the record relating to how we're dealing with the issues of suicide and sexual harassment, so I'll submit those for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. We will look forward to those answers on the record. Senator McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you both again, and thanks for your service. I appreciate all you're doing to ensure our Air Force is ready for the high-end fight, but we also have an obligation when our troops are on the ground to have the best capability overhead for combat search and rescue and close air support. So on to our beloved A-10. General Goldfein, is the Air Force committed to complying with all laws on the books and the intent of Congress related to the A-10?
Yes, ma'am, we are.
Thanks. When I first got to Congress, if they had gotten their way, the last administration, we would have no A-10s flying right now. So we stopped that in FY16. In FY17, I took a different approach. I said, we need to make sure that we think about this as we develop the F-35 and we have a thoughtful, sequential approach. So we required in Section 134 of the FY17 NDAA 2 reports. I wrote this, and it made it into law. The first was for the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation to submit the F-35 IOT&E report to Congress and to you. And then the second was a report by the Secretary of the Air Force, specifically after the IOT&E report was delivered, not later than 180 days, and I'm going to read this. The Secretary of the Air Force shall submit to Congress and the Defense Committees a report that includes the views of the Secretary with respect to this report including any issues or concerns, I'm kind of summarizing here, a plan for addressing any deficiencies, carrying out the corrective actions, and the short-term and long-term strategies for preserving capability of close air support and combat search and rescue. This also included the fly-off competition that I mandated, and that has been conducted between the A-10 and the F-35. So the final paragraph in that FY17 NDAA says, the Secretary of the Air Force may not retire, prepare to retire, or place in storage or on backup aircraft inventory any A-10 aircraft, until a period of 90 days has elapsed following the report, the second report. So first IOT&E after the fly-off competition, then the Secretary of the Air Force report. No A-10 can even be planned to be put into storage. I wanted to add thought about, but we couldn't enforce that. But I think you get the point. So the question is, and these are just kind of, yes and no, General Goldfein, have you received the initial operation test and evaluation report for the F-35?
No, ma'am.
And neither have we. So you've not been able to then inform any planning by the Secretary for the second report because we don't yet have the first report, right?
Correct.
So this committee and the Air Force doesn't have any plan for addressing deficiencies potentially from the IOT&E report.
Correct.
And also we don't have the plan for corrective action, right? And finally, neither the Air Force or the committee has the Air Force's short-term and long-term strategies for preserving close air support and combat search and rescue, correct?
Correct.
So, based on your answers and based on the law we wrote, I just think it's premature to plan to retire even one A-10, never mind the 44 that are planned to retire in this year's budget. So how do you justify the planning starting for this when we haven't met the intent of the law yet?
Yes, ma'am. The DOT&E report, the fly-off is complete. They're holding that report until they deliver it. The director informed me that he would deliver that to this committee in September, the first month of the fiscal year. We understand the timeline that's in the law, and we'll absolutely comply with the law. What we put in the budget was where we'll need to work with you on, because and the question is timing, as you brought up, right? Will there be time in that fiscal year to be able to move forward on any retirements and still be in compliance with the law? So that was our thinking.
Yeah, I got it. Look, we made it, I thought, very clear. Like, we shouldn't even start having a conversation to plan anything related to the floor we have of the number of A-10 now until this is all complete. So what is your plan going forward related to the A-10?
Yes, ma'am. I'll tell you straight up, you saved the A-10. Nobody else can make that claim. And as a result of your efforts and the efforts of this committee, we're putting almost $1 billion into the A-10. We're going to be doing the wings, the avionics, the radios, and we're going to keep that airplane in the inventory flying well into the 2030s. The challenge we faced is what I said in my opening statement, which is we have to transition to the future while we're continuing to apply firepower against the current fight. There is no better weapon system to do that than the A-10. So the investment that we're making is good investment. We just got to take a look at what the cost would be if we keep the entire fleet, and that's where we got to work with you on to do that. And
we will. Thanks. In my remaining time, I want to talk about the President recently reprogrammed resources. Look, as a veteran, as a border senator, we need to support our military and secure our border. These should not be choices and obstructions to stop happening. But I want to specifically ask about the F-35. The money that's being reprogrammed is, we've plussed up from your 48. We plussed up 14, so we funded 62. What's the impact on the Air Force F-35 and specifically any impact to Luke Air Force Base?
Yes, ma'am. There'll be no impact to Luke Air Force Base. The money that was diverted was for long lead items for aircraft that actually didn't come through in the budget. So we put 12 in the unfunded request for this year, but that was long lead items for certain parts. It was not procurement for the aircraft, so no impact on Luke.
So we're still going to have 62 come off the production line this year?
Yes,
Great.
ma'am.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator McSally. General, did your attorneys advise you that you are compliant with Senator McSally's provisions in the NDAA with regard to the A-10?
Sir, they did, and they did that based on, again, time. The fact that the report that Senator McSally is referring to was going to be delivered in the first month of the fiscal year and the number of months ahead of that, there was time to work with this committee on the retirement of those aircraft in this timeline.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator McSally. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for your service, and congratulations on your retirement, General. Someday I hope to be there. Anyway, as you can imagine, the 13 states that qualify for the C-130J recapitalization as appropriated in fiscal year 2017-19 are eager to hear where the Air Force is in this process. Our staffs were told in November we would get some kind of an update this winter. Hasn't come yet. In the meantime, I have inquired about the Air Force Strategic Basic scoring process for the decision, both because I'm interested from an oversight perspective and as someone who has to prioritize what I push for as an authorizer and an appropriator. I asked the Air Force if Congress would be allowed to know the score if it's National Guard location, particularly as it relates to others, and I was told no. The Air Force responded to my request for information with strategic basing process uses score sheets to determine a location's viability for a basing bed-down decision. However, the score sheets alone do not provide the full context of decision criteria and are no longer used in the basic process once candidate locations have been selected. Once selected, site surveys are conducted at each candidate location as part of the holistic assessment of its suitability. The Secretary of the Air Force also leverages inputs from Air Force corporate leaders, Chief of Staff, and military judgment. I understand that you need to do what is best for the Air Force, and we all need to support you to do what's best for the Air Force, and I am not one who prescribes just because I have something in my state that's the best. If they're not performing, I'm the first to say, either get with it or get out of it. So, with that being said, I'm very proud of the 130th Air Wing in Charleston, where we score really high on the score sheet, but might not be selected. So I want to make sure that we have a fair shot at this. So my question to you, Madam Secretary, is that the Air Force needs to show its work. Do you understand the Air Force process in limiting my ability to do oversight, and do you think it's too subjective what I'm asking in response?
Senator, the process is a complex one and goes through a variety of criteria, some of which are not easily measurable in quantifiable terms. We are... If I could just say maybe, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but time is limited, in that I know in any type of performance is based on past performance, how well their readiness, maintenance, being able to complete the missions, and that's what I think would be, to me, would be at top of that list of looking if they've been performing. Not just saying, I'm going to do it better if you do this for me, but have they performed in the past? We're hoping that's a high score too, but we like to see that. The past performance is deeply valued, and West Virginia has demonstrated their ability to produce and perform, so we appreciate it very much. The criteria are spelled out for the initial cut, and then there are site visits and things that are a lot less. Will we be able to see any of that as appropriator and as our priorities, as the legislators, will we be able to see the process you're going through, or is that not available? I don't know that whether it's been made available in the past, but I would be happy to take a look and see what we can provide. Would you consider that? Maybe you can get back with me on that? Be happy to. Love to follow you through. I like to go into this. First of all, I want to say I'm for the wall. I'm just not for the executive branch appropriating money as they see fit. And here's my concern. What really angers me is a $1.3 billion cut from the National Guard and Reserve Equipment account. $205 million, which is cut from the Air Force Reserve, $395 million cut from the Air National Guard. So, Secretary, I would ask you to consult on, did you agree to the reprogramming request, or was you involved in that decision? The Air Force worked with the Department of Defense to minimize the disruption that would be caused by the reappropriation of those funds. Were governors and the tags, were they consulted on the reprogramming? I don't think they were. Yeah, I don't think so. From what we're hearing, they weren't either. The amount of cuts, then we get right into that. How the reprogramming of the $365 million, that's 4 fewer C-130Js, and for fiscal year 20, affect the ability to support transcon airlift missions in the event of a conflict. It really puts us in a jeopardy and behind the 8 ball there, because we're flying the old H's now, and we're hoping that you're going to refurbish them with new avionics, propellers and engines and things that need to be done. We're behind. I mean, really concerned about this. So, what is your general? You might want to state on that. What?
I guess, what is your plans to ensure there's no gaps in readiness?
Yes, sir. I'll tell you that we're right now still working through the impacts, and the chairman was asked to give his assessment of the impacts on not only readiness but the strategic ability to defend the nation. And I think you saw his response, and that's where the Joint Chiefs are.
Well, there's no doubt there's going to be an impact. I know we all know that. I mean, how severe it's going to be. We'll be back here saying next year, if money's taken again from what we appropriate, we go through and do our job, and then all of a sudden it vanishes, and we're back to square one again. I don't have a problem voting for the wall. I sure have a problem money being taken for what's needed for us to defend our country.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary General, thank you for being here. Thank you for your service. General, let me start with you. My home state of Missouri is very excited and proud to receive the B-21, which will form a critical part of our nuclear triad and also our conventional global strike capability. And let me ask you this. How do you envision the B-21 helping to defeat a Chinese fait accompli scenario involving Taiwan when you consider both its nuclear and its conventional capabilities?
Yes, sir. You know, very often I tell my my slide builders, if I see the next slide I see that has a big red dome over China or Russia, I'm going to execute choke con on the slide builder. China can't put a big red block of wood over itself. It can put a block of Swiss cheese over itself, and our job is to know where the holes in are and how to get in and how to hold targets at risk. That's what the B-21 does.
Let me ask you about the number. You previously stated, General, that the Air Force requires at least, I think your words were at a minimum, 100 B-21s. You've also said you are in lockstep with various analyses showing the Air Force may need more than 100 B-21s. So give us your best estimate. How many B-21s does the Air Force actually require to cover down on both its nuclear and conventional missions?
Our assessment, and that's been backed up by independent assessments, that a moderate risk force is 220 bombers, of which 145 would be B-21s.
Very good. Thank you. General, Missouri is also home to the 139th Airlift Wing, which does incredible work to ensure that the Joint Force has the tactical airlift it needs. We're very proud of that as well. Can you tell us how you see the Air National Guard airlift with units like the 139th enabling distributed operations in the Indo-Pacific and Europe?
That unit, like all of our Guard units, I know it's one of the beauties of the way the Air Force is organized. You know, when I would travel around as the Air Component Commander in Central Command, I'd go to up in the cockpit of a C-17 or a C-130, and I'd say, okay, who's active, who's Guard, who reserve, and all three hands would go up. Such is the nature of how we're integrated. We could not do the nation's business without our Guard and Reserve. Could not do it.
Let me ask you about modernizing the C-130H and the expanding number of C-130Js. How might doing those things for the Air National Guard enable those units to support the kind of operations we've been talking about?
Well, both in the C-130J, which is just a phenomenal weapon system. I think we're running out of letters in the alphabet for the C-130. So the C-130J is just incredible. And the upgrades we're doing on the C-130H with the AMP, the new avionics, is going to keep that weapon system flying as well. And when we get back to Senator Hirono's point about agile combat employment, you know, part of your ability to be able to move to win is your tactical lift. And so we're taking a fresh look at, you know, where do the C-130s live and how do they play relative to being able to move very quickly around a battlefield. And I think that's going to become more important as we go forward.
Very good. Let me ask you about the LRASM missiles. The FY21 budget, General, says the Air Force is planning to buy, I think, 129 LRASMs between now and FY25. I'm just curious, does the Air Force have any other advanced anti-ship weapons in its inventory besides the LRASMs?
That's the only one I can talk about in the unclassified realm. And I will tell you, sir, that the munitions story is actually a really good news story. Based on additional money that was given to us, we've been able to grow the munitions bins in some preferred munitions in ways we haven't done for years. Just to give you an example, we were in FY18, we were at 44% for JDAMs. We're now at 88%. So just to give you an example of how we've done the munitions bins.
Let me ask you just about the LRASMs in particular, and considering the vital role that they play, particularly in defeating Chinese surface forces, do you think 129 is enough? I mean, do we need to be buying more?
We always need to be buying more, sir. I will tell you that we balance that against all the other requirements. Right now, I will tell you that some of the lowest stock numbers we have are in air-to-air missiles, And so we've been focusing there recently.
Let me ask you, General, shifting topics just slightly. Over the last 5 years, the Air Force has, I think, pretty dramatically improved its ability to conduct distributed operations in the European theater. And is it fair to say that a lot of those improvements were made possible by the European Deterrence Initiative? Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Can you just speak just briefly about how EDI has helped the Air Force adopt a more resilient posture in Europe?
So the Army focused on prepositioned stocks. We focused on access and basing, because an Air Force is expected in the operational plan to arrive quickly because we can fly into theater, halt enemy activity, and stabilize the situation for follow-on activity. So therefore, we need bases that we can operate from. So we put our money into access and basing, and that's allowed us to have a much larger footprint.
Thank you for that. And I'll just say, Mr. Chairman, this is why I continue to believe that something similar to a dedicated funding stream is vital for INDOPACOM. Thank you. Thank you, General. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure to whom to address this question, but I'm curious about $77 million for Space Force OCO. I think of OCO as overseas contingency operations. Are we 77 million people up in space, or what's? I'm just curious. What's the 77 million for OCO for Space Force?
Well, in just our conference, it seems likely that is places like Thule, the Arctic, Alaska is considered OCO, so those would be
people manning space-related facilities. Is that what we're talking about?
So the space-related facilities and the manning of them.
If you could give me a little more
would be
robust information, I'd appreciate it. Madam Secretary, how are we doing on the sustainment cost of the F-35? Are we going to be able to afford to keep it?
It's one of the topics of great attention. It is being driven down, but it is, from our perspective, too slowly and still too high. We have a commitment that by the year 2025, it would be at $25,000 per hour, and we hope that we anticipate that will be achieved.
So you're continue to make this a priority, because it's a serious ongoing issue. I mean, we're not going to be able to sustain this important asset indefinitely at the kind of cost that we're talking about now.
Agreed.
Sure, if I could jump in as well. So I met with the CEO for Lockheed Martin and all the CEOs who are partners in this, and told them that the current flying hour costs are unaffordable, and the sustainment enterprise was not scaled to the size of the fleet. So we worked through about a 3 to 4 month sprint, both with the Joint Program Office and the company. And I went to Lockheed and walked through all the things they're doing in the sustainment enterprise, and I will tell you that they've made some significant changes to the point where I'm more confident that we're going to be able to drive to that lower flying hour cost than we were 6 months ago.
Could you supply for the committee some data and
Yes,
written
sir.
material on this issue? Because I think it's one we just don't want to let it get away from us.
Be happy to.
Madam Secretary, I noticed there's an increase in end strength of about 1,500 people. Are any of those, I hope some of those are maintenance personnel, because I understand that's a bottleneck in terms of readiness. How are we doing on maintenance personnel, techs, to keep these airplanes flying?
Historically, that has been a confining topic. Some good news is that in the active duty force, our maintainers are up to speed at this point. We're still working on the Guard and Reserve count.
How are we doing on recruiting? Are you meeting goals?
On maintainers,
General?
Sure.
We are, sir. And the good news on the maintenance is we've actually filled in what was a 4,000 shortfall. We got that down to 0. We still have some work to do in the Guard and Reserve on maintainers. When it comes to recruiting, we are meeting our numbers. One of the things we've done recently is we've gone to total force recruiting. We pulled Guard and Reserve and active into one recruiting command. And so now when you go to a strip mall, you don't see 3 different storefronts. You see one United States Air Force, because quite frankly, for the Secretary and I, when a young man or woman wants to join the Air Force, we don't really care which component they join. They're joining us.
Because we have an integrated force in reality.
Because it's an integrated force.
Now,
so,
the Army is doing some work on diversifying the geography of their recruiting. As you know, in New England or in the Northeast, there are very few military facilities left, and we really don't want the military to be regionalized. Are you attending to that issue?
We are, sir, and we're also looking at it especially through how do we hire civilians. You gave us authority to direct hire civilians faster, and so this is a competitive market. This is a fight for talent. And so now with those authorities, we're able to go to universities, many of them in New England, and direct hire folks into the Air Force. And especially, I think, as Chief Raymond looks at how he builds the Space Force, there's some really creative things that we might be able to do there with the authorities that you've given us.
I appreciate that. And if you need additional authorities or if there are other bottlenecks, let us know. One final question. General Lyons was here a week or two ago and talked about the impending gap in refueling capacity, which was he identified as one of the most serious threats that we face. We can't project power unless we have refueling capacity. Is there a plan? Is there a how are we going to meet that 5 to 7 year problem that appears to be imminent?
So the first thing is in terms of mitigation. We've committed to him and to the Secretary of Defense that if we were in a major contingency, every KC-46 would be put into the fight. We're comfortable that it's capable of doing operations in a high-end fight.
Even with the deficiency?
Even with the deficiency. I would not put it into day-to-day operations, but I would put it into high-end fight. And when we took a look at the retirement numbers, what we're talking about is 3% of the entire KC-135 fleet. And we're managing risk across the board. We're managing shortages in bombers, tankers, ISR, fighters, command and control. And so tankers is one area that we are having to manage. And so that's why in the beginning I mentioned that was one of the most difficult decisions we had to make in game, was to ask for us to take risk in the tanker business.
I appreciate, and I'd ask General Lyons some further backup on the plans.
Yes.
Because for want of a nail, the horse was lost. For one of the horse, the battle. We don't want to lose a battle because we can't get our airmen and their horses to the battlefront.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
General, we talked about this earlier, and Senator King brought it back up. The ranking member and I are just wondering, the refueling can be done. It's just trickier.
Yes, sir. So I've flown the airplane twice. Let me describe it for you. So
Did you do a refueling?
We did. Actually, I refueled a C-17. I got to fly the remote visual system. Got to see it in all different lighting conditions. And so there are operational workarounds that allow me to tell you that I would put it in the fight, but I would not accept that aircraft today in terms of what we're paying the company to deliver. And so what happens is that the receptacle on an airplane, at the last 10 feet or so, as you're now trying to connect with an airplane, the last 10 feet, it's difficult for the boom operator to actually focus in and see those last 10 feet. So we're seeing more strikes around the receptacle before it actually plugs in. The worst case conditions would be blue skies, sun at your back, because what happens is there's a glare that now bounces off the airplane that makes it harder to see. Well, you check about 20 degrees away, and you can mitigate that risk. But I ought not be having to mitigate that risk in daily operations. We ought to get what we paid for.
Mr. Chairman, I flew the boom on a tanker once.
And that does not give me a comfort level.
Well, no, it will, because there wasn't another airplane attached.
If the other senators will defer, Senator Reid.
Just very briefly, there are two aspects to this. One is flying the tanker. The other is the aircraft that's approaching to refuel.
Right.
And if we're not training on a regular basis these aircraft to refuel with the KC-46, to suddenly put it into the fight is not going to be particularly effective, because all the other aircraft will be coming up there for the first time, and it'll be a problem.
These airplanes, though, sir, will be involved in test. So they will be doing refueling as we work through the tests of the fix that we're hoping to get to. So we wouldn't be starting, nor would I put a crew in that was not trained for the mission. It was just, in terms of mitigation on why we would retire some tankers, part of the mitigation is that we would put the KC-46 into the fight.
This is a continuing conversation, but the concern I have just briefly is that in the fight, which would be sudden and quick, and now these aircraft, the KC-46, is suddenly a prime refueler, you would have literally hundreds of aircraft and pilots who have never approached this before, and that's not the way you usually operate.
They would have in training, would they not?
Yes, sir. But I'll tell you, if you talk about the receiver,
right?
Quite frankly, I've refueled on every different kind of tanker out there. Plus, I've refueled on remote visual systems off of a Dutch tanker. When you're on the receiving end, all you need is a stable boom. And because you're training on refueling all the time, the boom is the boom. It's not going to matter that much for the receiver. We just got to make sure that when that fighter, bomber, what have you, comes off and they're low on gas and they're in really bad territory like I've been, that connection happens and they get the fuel pass that they need.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing us to interject there. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Goldfein, I do want to thank you, like many others, for your exceptional service to our nation. I think you're going to be sorely missed, and you've really, really, really done a great job. I do hope you come back, and appreciate the breakfast and briefing just a couple of weeks ago as well. And Madam Secretary, we're looking forward to getting you to Alaska, hosting you. The whole state's looking forward to having you up there. You'll see why Billy Mitchell called it the most strategic place in the world. See our great airmen in Jay Park, and you can probably even see Russia too if it's a clear day. So we're really looking forward to that. I'm going to continue the theme here on the KC-46. This might be a really dumb, basic question, but for now, just following up on this discussion we just had, like, is there any way to just take the boom hardware from the KC-135 and, I mean, that works. And you can't do that as an interim replacement until, they figure out what the heck, as Senator Shaheen said, time is of the essence. You said it, but 4 years doesn't seem like time is of the essence. Is there no fix to help? I mean, the KC-135 is a workhorse, works pretty well.
So there's no option of just swapping the boom, because the boom is not the problem. The visual system that allows the boom operator to be able to connect with the receiver is the problem. So what we have to have...
You can't use a KC-135?
No.
Okay.
No, because in the 135, there's a huge window in the back that the boom operator is laying down looking at.
Let me ask on the other issue, you won't be surprised to hear my continuing advocacy on the issue, but it's not just me. On the Oconus bed-down decision on the KC-46, this committee's weighed in, a number of NDAAs, so the Congress has weighed in because they become law, talking about characteristics in General Goldfein. I raised this in the last hearing, strategic location, the ability to serve several COCOMs, hub air combat power, 24/7 NORAD mission that routinely intercepts Russian bombers, world-class training, 3 red flag exercises a year, 105th generation fighters, C-17s, C-130s, F-16s. These are all characteristics that this committee has said are important. I just had breakfast this morning with the SecDef. He in his confirmation hearing mentioned that you co-locate 105th gen fighters and KC-46s in a very strategic location. That would send the message of extreme strategic reach to our adversaries, particularly our great power adversaries. Do either you care to comment on this upcoming decision as it relates to these congressionally mandated characteristics, which certainly favor, in my view, one of the locations you're looking at?
My ability to, as in the line of decision making, I'll await the input and the analysis, but those no doubt are going to be elements that will be considered.
Okay, thank you, Madam Secretary. Just building on that, and again, it's just General Lyons recently testified, it was just last week, I think, and as you've already heard, he said the air refueling fleet, that's the most stress capability and #1 readiness concern. The ability to deploy the force across all national defense strategy mission areas. Again, to me,
if you put the KC-46s in a place that can strategically reach not just PACOM, but PACOM, EUCOM, STRATCOM, NORTHCOM, which is what Alaska presents, it helps with that stress. I think that's actually an important concern. Would either of you care to comment on that? He did in the classified briefing, just for the record. You can take a look at what he said, which was, I think, along the lines of what I've been arguing.
No, sir, I'd align with that.
Madam Secretary, you want to wave that one off too?
No further comment on it.
Just as you're making the decision, I think take a look at his testimony also. I think it helps. General Goldfein and Madam Secretary, I just want one final quick question on the J Park and the 5th Gen Center of Excellence. You know, I was just asked my staff, I didn't know the numbers are this big, but as you probably know, J Park is 13 times larger than Nellis. And as we have increasing offsets that are needed for good training with the 5th Gen aircraft and the ability to expand that airspace, which in Alaska we're doing, and it's not that controversial as it is in the lower 48 to expand airspace. Can you comment on that?
Sure, I'll just say that it is critical strategic terrain, and larger airspace becomes more important as we end up engaging at longer ranges, which is what 5th generation is all about and what comes after that. So we're going to, I see actually more of an effort to ensure that we can replicate the higher end threat at J Park and Nellis and Utah in these ranges. The good news is that software-defined radios are giving us more inexpensive ways of replicating higher-end threats, which has been challenging in the past. So one of the things we're looking at right now is how do we scale very quickly in that range space to put a robust array out to be able to replicate a high-end threat. And I think over the next couple of years we're going to be able to do it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. And General Goldfein, I wish you the very best and what I hope is just a change of jobs, not a real retirement. I want to start back maybe on the KC-46. We know it's we're going to have some down at Seymour Johnson. We've got the hangar project. I know that it was originally slated for later this year, where we are with the hangar project, where we are with the deployment. And there was one project that was affected with some of the reprogramming of the MILCON money. I think it was a relatively low dollar item, but I believe it did have to do with the ultimate deployment of the tankers. So if I can get an update on that, I would appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I don't know that right now I have not been briefed that it would have any impact on the bed down timing, but let me take that to make sure, and can I get back to you?
Yeah, I know at the time that we were going through those discussions, it didn't look like it was on the critical path. I would like to know when it would be, as we work to backfill that funding. Thank you. I know that we recently, I think as recently as last week, put out the Tenant Bill of Rights for our military housing situation. It looks like it may be a good start, but there are some who feel like it needs to go further. Can you give me an update specifically with the Air Force, what progress we're making, and what priority this is for you, Secretary Barrett?
Well, it's very high priority. My first visit as Secretary was to go to a base and to do a walkthrough of housing. I've gone through a number of base housing facilities and have been very much involved in this process. We signed out the Bill of Rights, but only 15 of the 18 elements, but the 3 elements that were not on the Bill of Rights, in contrast with what were the directed 18, were 3 things that we could not unilaterally do. They were mandate the disclosure of maintenance records back 7 years. In some cases, there aren't 7 years of records, so we have to work on that. The dispute resolution technique, because again, in some cases, the housing provider has bonds that they cannot breach in the dispute resolution process. And the third item is withholding of the rent. So those 3 items we're working through as a contractual matter, and we'll anticipate having solutions to those as well as time goes on. In the meantime, we are withholding payments to these contractors, in some cases significant amounts of payments, and so there is a financial involvement. I believe, do have their attention at this point, and there is apparently good faith effort to move this forward.
Well, very good. After the NDA, I know that you all tried to move forward with the promulgation of the Tenant Bill of Rights. We're looking for feedback on additional things that we should put into this NDA to help us get rid of what I think is an unacceptable situation with a lot of our military families in housing. So thank you for that. One other parochial issue, and if I have time, I may have one other question. Otherwise, I'll submit it for the record. North Carolina has the most historically black colleges and universities in the nation. We have 11. We have the largest at NCA&T, and we have the most affordable down at Elizabeth City State. And they've got a program specifically focused on aviation science. They're doing a good job there. They've got a great collaboration with the Coast Guard. We're working right now to help out with maybe some runway upgrades, and they also have the college student pre-commissioning initiative there that I think has been very good for talent building. One thing that I'd be interested in getting your commitment to is just considering whether or not we could have an Air Force ROTC program down there, just to take a look at it. I had some of my staff down visiting with the Chancellor recently. It's an impressive program. We've got a record of collaboration with the Coast Guard, and I'd like y'all to give that a look. Can I get your commitment to take a look at that?
Full commitment.
Thank you. Last thing, I'll submit a question I had on the EQ4 and some movement to manned versus unmanned platforms for the record. But I would also, I got a great briefing from the Army on their taking advantage of some of the provisions in the NDA around talent management. They look like they're really moving aggressively. Can you all give me an idea of how we're going to look a year from now or in the coming months with the Air Force?
So we're going through the largest overhaul of our officer talent management and enlisted talent management since about the early 80s. So not only are we using technology for the purposes of managing career paths, but we have busted the single line of the Air Force promotion category into 6 categories. We're defining what behaviors that we desire and what constitutes a competitive career for the purposes of promotion. So a year from now, it's not going to look anything like it does today.
Good. If we can get an opportunity, I'd like to have maybe a briefing in the office. I thought it was very helpful for us to do that. We can get into greater detail. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both.
And thank you, Senator Tillis. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses. We look forward to continue working with you. And this marks the conclusion of our hearing. And the hearing is now adjourned.